Listen carefully. Not everyone who asks you for help is truly helpless. Some people stretch out a hand, but what they really want is not your money. They want your favor. They want your peace. They want the good things that were already waiting for you. And the painful part is this. You may walk away thinking you did a kind thing, while something precious has quietly been taken from your life. That is why not every act of giving should be careless. Kindness is beautiful, yes. But kindness without discernment can open doors you never intended to open. If you pay close attention to this story, you will understand why some people's lives suddenly begin to fall apart after a single, ordinary moment they did not even think mattered. You will also understand why one young man's simple habit saved not only his own future, but an entire community. You are watching a story where every moment carries a lesson, and this one may change the way you help people forever. Once upon a time, in the loud and restless heart of Accra, where the streets never seemed to sleep and the markets breathed like living things, there was a woman nearly everyone knew, but no one truly understood. She sat at the same corner near Makola Market, just where the crowd thickened before the trotro stop. From morning until evening, through dry days and rainy days, through market rush and quiet afternoons, she was always there. People called her Ma Serwa. Nobody was sure if that was her real name. Nobody knew where she had come from. Nobody knew whether she had children, family, or anyone waiting for her at home. She had simply been there for so long that many believed she belonged to that corner the same way the broken pavement did. To look at her, your heart would soften immediately. She was thin, so thin that her cheekbones rose sharply beneath her dark skin. Her wrapper was always faded. Her blouse was patched in places with cloth that did not even match. A worn headscarf covered most of her hair. Her sandals were cracked. Sometimes she sat with one leg stretched awkwardly, as though pain had settled permanently into her bones. But it was her face people remembered most. She had the face of someone life had dealt with cruelly. The face of a woman who had been left behind by time, luck, and the kindness of other human beings. When she raised her hand and asked softly for help, many people felt it would be wicked to ignore her. And so, they gave. They gave coins. They gave notes. They gave food. They gave out of pity, out of faith, out of the belief that no one should suffer alone in public. That was exactly what Ma Serwa depended on, because what people did not know was that she was not living off their money. She was feeding on something else. The first person people clearly remembered was a man named Kwame Botang. Kwame sold imported rice, cooking oil, and canned goods from a small but respectable shop close to Agbobloshi. He was not rich, but he was solid. The kind of man who had built his life little by little. He opened early, closed late, kept careful records, and was known for never cheating his customers. One Tuesday morning, while passing through Makola to buy stock, he saw Ma Serwa sitting on the roadside. She looked weaker than usual that day. Her lips were dry. Her hand trembled as she stretched it toward him. Kwame stopped. Something in him shifted. He reached into his pocket and placed a generous amount of money into her hand. She looked up at him. No smile, no blessing, no thank you. Just a long look. A look so cold and heavy that he felt uncomfortable for a second, though he could not explain why. Then she lowered her eyes and turned away. Kwame went on with his day. 3 months later, his shop began to collapse. Not all at once. That would have been easier to understand. It happened in pieces. First, a shipment he had already paid for was delayed. Then 2 bags of rice arrived spoiled. Then a refrigerator he depended on for drinks failed at the hottest point of the month. Then a trusted worker began stealing from him. Then a supplier suddenly cut him off and demanded payment for goods Kwame had already settled. By the time 6 months had passed, the man who once stood proudly behind a full shop was sitting in near emptiness, staring at shelves that no longer carried hope. People said business was hard. People said the economy was rough. People said these things happened. Kwame told himself the same thing. Then came Abina Owusu. Abina was 7 months pregnant with her first child. The whole family was excited. Her husband had already chosen names. Her mother had begun buying baby cloths. Everything about the pregnancy had gone smoothly, and the doctors saw no reason to worry. One hot afternoon after a clinic visit, Abina passed through Makola with a small bag of fruit and some change in her purse. She saw Ma Serwa. The old woman looked especially pitiful that day, breathing hard, one hand pressed against her chest as if hunger itself was twisting her from the inside. Abina felt compassion immediately. She reached into her purse and gave her money. Again, that same look. That same strange, watchful stare. 2 weeks later, Abina lost the baby. The grief was so sudden and violent that it tore through the whole family. Nothing had seemed wrong. Nothing had warned them. Doctors spoke carefully, but no explanation felt large enough for the hole that had opened in her life. When her aunt began asking quiet questions around the neighborhood, she discovered something deeply disturbing. Abina was not the only one. There were other women, other pregnancies, other unexpected losses. And hidden in the background of more than one story was the same roadside woman at Makola. At first, the whispers stayed soft. Nobody wanted to sound foolish. Nobody wanted to be called superstitious. Nobody wanted to accuse a helpless-looking old woman of anything dark. But the whispers grew. There was Ya Mensima, a young man who had finally secured a visa interview after years of trying to travel. On his way to complete the final documents, he gave Ma Serwa money. 2 days later, one missing paper ruined the whole process, and the opportunity vanished. There was Madame Ifia, a seamstress whose customer base had taken years to build. She helped Ma Serwa one rainy evening when almost everyone else ignored her. Within the month, 3 of her best clients left. One sewing machine broke beyond repair, and a wedding contract she had counted on was canceled without warning. There was Kojo Tete, a brilliant student waiting for scholarship results. He gave the old woman money while hurrying through the market. When the final list came out, his name was missing, even though everyone had believed he was one of the strongest candidates. One story could be coincidence. 2 stories could be bad luck. But when lives kept cracking in the same pattern, people began to feel something colder than fear. Still, they kept giving. That was the tragic part. They kept giving because Ma Serwa always looked so genuinely broken. They kept giving because not every disaster happened the next day. Sometimes it took weeks, sometimes a month, sometimes longer. And when pain comes late, people rarely trace it back to an ordinary act of kindness they barely remember. So the corner remained busy, and Ma Serwa remained seated on her mat, collecting money, collecting pity, collecting chances that did not belong to her. What nobody saw was what happened after dark. Every evening, just before the market fully thinned out and the sky over Accra turned smoky orange, Ma Serwa would rise. And when she rose, she no longer moved like a weak old woman. Her back straightened. Her steps became steady. She wrapped her coins and notes carefully into cloth, tucked the bundle against her side, and walked through narrower streets behind the market, avoiding conversation, avoiding attention, avoiding anyone who might try to follow. She lived in a small compound hidden behind a row of aging buildings where few people had reason to go. Neighbors kept their distance. Not because she quarreled, not because she made noise, but because something about her felt wrong in a way that language could not easily hold. Once, a boy chasing a ball too close to her gate peeped through a crack and came running back, pale and shaking. He said he saw her seated in the middle of the courtyard in front of a clay bowl, speaking to money like it was alive. People laughed at him, but he never laughed when he told that story again. At night, Ma Serwa spread every coin and note before her. She touched each one slowly, turned each one over in her fingers, murmured words too low for any outsider to hear. Sometimes there was smoke, though no fire was visible. Sometimes dogs in the lane outside began barking all at once for no reason anyone could explain. Sometimes the air itself seemed to thicken around her walls. Because for Ma Serwa, the money was not the reward, it was the vessel. Every gift carried something invisible, a person's goodwill, a person's open-heartedness, a person's grace at the moment they gave. And somehow, through means no honest person should ever crave to understand, she knew how to pull that sweetness away from the giver's life and bend it toward darkness. In the morning, she would dress again in her tired clothes, bend her shoulders, slow her steps, and return to her corner looking weak enough to break anyone's heart. This went on for years. Years of ruined businesses, years of lost opportunities, years of silent grief, years of people telling themselves not to imagine what they were beginning to suspect. Until one ordinary Thursday changed everything. The man at the center of that turning point was named Kofi Mensah. Kofi was 31 years old and worked as an appliance repair technician near Kantamanto. He was not famous. He was not wealthy. He did not come from an influential family. He was the kind of man people often overlook because his life was simple and his manner was calm. But Kofi had one habit that quietly shaped everything about him. He prayed over small things. Not loudly, not for show, not with the kind of performance that draws attention, just sincerely. Before leaving home in the morning, he prayed. Before accepting a new job, he prayed. Before entering unfamiliar places, he prayed. Before helping people, he prayed. To some, that might have looked unnecessary. To Kofi, it was simply wisdom. That Thursday morning, he was on his way through Makola, carrying a small tool bag and thinking about a customer whose freezer needed urgent work. He saw Ma Serwa. He had heard bits and pieces of the rumors around her, but like many others, he never fully knew what to believe. What he saw in front of him was still an old woman on the roadside. He reached into his pocket and found a folded note. Then, as always, he paused. Not out of fear, not because anyone was watching, just because that was his habit. Quietly, in his heart, he said, "Lord, I give this with a clean heart. Let this kindness remain blessed. Let no evil attach itself to me, my home, my work, or my future. Cover this act with your hand." That was all. He placed the money into her palm and began to walk away. Ma Serwa looked up, and for the first time in many years, something went wrong. She tried to do what she had always done, to reach spiritually into the moment of giving and take what rode with it, the favor, the light, the open door hidden inside generosity. But she struck resistance. Not a weak resistance, not something she could wear down with patience. A wall. A force around that act she could not enter. Something clean, something firm, something that did not belong to her and would not answer to her. She pushed harder. It came back against her like a slammed gate. Kofi noticed nothing. He kept walking, thinking only about his workday and whether the customer would be home when he arrived. But Ma Serwa sat unnaturally still. Something had happened that had never happened before. For the first time, she had been denied. Days passed. Kofi's life continued steadily. In fact, small things began going unusually well for him. A customer recommended him to a bigger client. An overdue payment came in at the exact moment he needed it. A brother who had been struggling found stable work. There was no sudden miracle, no dramatic wealth, just a quiet flow of things opening instead of closing. Meanwhile, one woman had been paying close attention. Her name was Auntie Akos. She sold tomatoes, onions, and pepper not far from Ma Serwa's corner, and she had one of those minds that never forgot details. She had seen Kofi stop. She had seen him pause first with his head slightly bowed. She had seen him give the money. And unlike so many others before him, she had also seen him weeks later still moving through life with peace written on his face. That unsettled her in a different way. So one afternoon, she called him over and asked casually how things were going. Kofi smiled and said, "By God's grace, well." Auntie Akos said nothing more, but her thoughts began to move. That evening she mentioned it to another trader. The trader mentioned it to her older brother. By the weekend, the story had reached a respected elder named Nana Badu, a man known not for noise, but for careful judgment. Nana Badu did not dismiss what he heard. He came quietly to the area one market day and stood at a distance. He watched Ma Serwa. He watched how her eyes followed some givers more intensely than others. He watched the strange way her fingers lingered on money before dropping it into her cloth. He watched the people around her, the pity, the ease, the ordinary blindness that had protected her for so long. Then he asked a few trusted people to do something simple. Pray. Not publicly, not dramatically, just quietly, over the corner, over the people who passed it, over the hands that gave there, over the hidden thing no one could see, but many had already suffered from. And slowly, something began to shift. It happened fully on a Friday. The market was noisy. Hawkers were calling. Drivers were shouting. Women were bargaining over fish and yam and cloth. Nothing about the day looked unusual. A civil servant named Mr. Amankwa had just decided that he would finally help the old woman. He had passed her many times without stopping, but that morning he felt especially soft-hearted. He reached into his pocket. At that exact moment, a little girl, no more than 6 years old, slipped free from her mother's hand in the crowd and wandered near Ma Serwa's mat. The child froze. Then she screamed. Not the scream of a stubborn child, not the cry of someone who fell. A scream from deep terror. The kind of scream that makes adults stop before they understand why. She pointed directly at Ma Serwa and shook so hard her mother could barely lift her. "Her eyes!" the girl kept crying. "Her eyes!" The mother pulled her back, but now she herself was staring. Really staring. Not with pity, not with a passing glance, but with full attention. And once attention settled on Ma Serwa, others began to look too. Mr. Amankwa slowly returned the money to his pocket. A jewelry seller nearby gasped and said she had just remembered the week her own business collapsed after helping that same woman. Another trader said his sister's pregnancy ended not long after giving to her. A student said his cousin's visa trouble began the same way. A seamstress said she had ignored the rumors until now, but suddenly none of them felt ridiculous anymore. Truth, once it begins to move, rarely travels alone. The crowd thickened. Voices rose. Then Nana Badu stepped forward. He was an old man, but when he spoke, people listened. For a few seconds, the whole place grew still enough to hear him clearly. He said, "Too many lives have bent downward after meeting kindness with this woman. Too many stories carry the same shadow. We have been afraid to say what we know, but fear does not turn lies into truth." No sooner had he finished speaking than something in Ma Serwa's face changed. It was not anger. It was not confusion. It was exposure. The suffering mask she had worn for years slipped just enough for everyone nearest to her to see what had always lived beneath it. A coldness that had nothing to do with poverty and everything to do with appetite. People stepped back. Some began to pray aloud. Some ran. Some simply stood in shock, because the thing they had refused to name for so long had finally taken shape before their eyes. Ma Serwa was no longer hidden. Over the next days, Accra buzzed with the story. People who had suffered began connecting pieces of their own past. Old losses suddenly seemed less random. Long, unexplained streaks of misfortune began to look different in memory. And then, just as quietly as destruction had once spread, restoration began. Kwame Boateng met a new supplier who trusted him enough to offer flexible terms. Within months, his shop was fuller than it had been in years. Abina conceived again. This time, the pregnancy held strong from beginning to end, and when she delivered safely, she wept more from relief than joy, because at last the sorrow had broken. Ya received a different travel opportunity, better than the first one he had lost. Madame Afia's work returned, not all at once, but steadily. The customers who came back brought others with them. Some recoveries were slow, some wounds stayed tender, but the direction had changed. And when direction changes from darkness to light, even small progress begins to feel holy. People started praising Kofi, saying he was the one who broke Ma Serwa's power. But Kofi shook his head every time. He said, "I am not special. I only covered my giving with prayer." That answer stayed with people because it sounded too simple to be powerful. Yet it was powerful. Not because the words were magical, not because Kofi was important, but because faith had been invited into an ordinary moment, and darkness found no empty space there to occupy. The community eventually held a gathering near the very market corner where Ma Serwa had sat for so many years. People came not for spectacle, but for closure. One by one, those who had suffered stood and spoke. Kwame told the story of his ruined shop. Abina spoke of the child she lost and the grief that nearly swallowed her. Madame Ifia described months of hunger she could never previously explain. Others spoke too: traders, students, wives, husbands, mothers, men whose luck had suddenly died, women whose peace had gone strangely cold. No court could have measured those losses properly. They were too invisible in origin and too personal in consequence. When the testimonies ended, Nana Badu rose again. He looked at Ma Serwa for a long time before speaking. Then he said, "Mercy was placed in your hands, and you turned it into a weapon. You used the softness of human hearts as a doorway into their futures. A community that knows the truth cannot continue pretending it does not. You will not stay here. There was no shouting after that, no dramatic struggle. Ma Serwa knew it was over. 2 men escorted her away from the market district that same day. Some claimed they later saw her near another bus station in a different town. Others said she moved farther inland. But one thing was certain: she never again sat at makola. Without the crowd she had fed on for years, she began to fade for real. Not the performance of weakness she once wore. Real weakness, real hunger, real loneliness. Because a life built on stealing what belongs to others eventually collapses when there is nothing left to steal. About 2 years later, word came back through quiet channels that Ma Serwa was dead. No one could say exactly where. No one could point to a grave with certainty. She had left lives in fragments, and in the end, she herself disappeared into the same kind of lonely silence she had long deserved. No one celebrated. But there was relief. The deep relief of a people who had carried a hidden burden too long and were finally breathing in clear air again. Years passed. The market kept moving. Children grew. New traders arrived. Old wounds slowly lost their sharpest edge. But the story did not die. Mothers told it to daughters while plaiting their hair. Fathers told it to sons on slow evenings after work. Traders warned younger traders. Churchwomen repeated it during conversations about discernment. Even those who did not know every detail still remembered the lesson. And the lesson was never, do not help the poor. No, that was never the lesson. The poor must still be helped. A hard heart is not wisdom. Cruelty is not discernment. Human need is real, and kindness must not vanish from the earth. The lesson was this: do not give carelessly. Do not move through serious moments asleep in your spirit. Do not assume every outstretched hand carries clean intentions. And above all, do not separate generosity from prayer, because what is covered is harder to corrupt. What is offered with faith is harder to intercept. What is placed in God's hands does not remain exposed in the hands of darkness. When people asked why Kofi had been different, Auntie Akos always answered the same way. She said it was not because he was richer, not because he prayed louder, not because heaven loved him more than others. It was because he had a habit. A quiet, consistent habit. He involved God in ordinary moments. Even a folded note, even a roadside encounter, even a brief act of compassion on the way to work. And that habit became a wall evil could not cross. From that story, the people carried 3 truths forward. First, not everything that looks broken is innocent. Sometimes suffering is real. Sometimes it is a costume. So ask for discernment. Second, evil can hide for a long time, but it cannot hide forever. Truth may move slowly, but it keeps moving. Third, keep your heart generous, but keep your giving covered. A prayer over a small act is never wasted, because sometimes the difference between loss and protection is only one moment of spiritual awareness. Sometimes the thing that saves a future is not a grand miracle. Just a simple pause, a simple prayer, a simple habit. And if you ever pass through a crowded market and feel your heart moved to help someone, help if you truly can. But do not help thoughtlessly. Let wisdom walk with kindness. Let prayer travel with generosity. Let discernment stand beside compassion. Because a clean heart is good, but a clean heart that is also covered is stronger. And that is how one ordinary young man in Accra, without ever planning to, became the reason a hidden darkness finally lost its place among the living. So remember this story well, not so that you become suspicious of everyone, but so that you never again treat a spiritual matter like it is only physical. Some battles begin in very ordinary places. At a roadside, in a market, at a handshake, inside a gift. And some victories begin just as simply, with a whispered prayer no one else even hears.